Okay, so going to go over making triacylglycerides out of the free fatty acids, which we just finished in the other pathway. So our end product is going to look like this. Glycerol backbone, which is a sugar, alcohol, and then it's going to have a fatty acid there on its site number 1, a fatty acid there on site number 2, and then it's going to have a phosphate on site number 3, and then a fatty acid on that phosphate. All of this together is called a TAG, or triacylglycerol. Acyl is another word for a fatty acid, and so that is why it's a triacylglycerol. If you took one of the fatty acids off, it would be a diacylglycerol, because then there's only 2. And if you took 2 of them off, then it would be a monoacylglycerol. So you have TAGs, DAGs, and MAGs. Something important to know is that not every triacylglycerol has the exact same fatty acids. You can have triacylglycerols that have one of them that's much longer than the others, or unsaturated, or a whole bunch of other things. Oh, and I should have, for TAGs, you actually take the phosphate off. You start with a phosphate there and you remove it. So that was my mistake. There is not a phosphate in TAGs. Okay, so that is a TAG. TAGs are used mostly just for storage. They're not usually functional molecules except for the structural integrity of the membrane. You'll find some of them in there, I think. But they aren't typically, to my knowledge, used as like functional units. It's mostly a storage thing. All right, so the other thing that we may as well talk about at the same time, because this is where the 2 pathways both are like right there, and honestly, it took me forever to figure out how to fit this other pathway in until I finally found out that it was right here. And that is where we have the one that I drew before, where you have glycerol, acyl, and phosphate, acyl. And this, I'm going to go ahead and take this last one off really well. No, I'll have it there. This is going to be called a phosphoglycerol. Okay, and phosphoglycerols are going to have, phosphatidylglycerols are going to have a whole bunch of functions, and that's where we can have like secondary messengers.
Oh, like phosphatidylcholine.
Phosphatidylcholine, yes. Okay. And phosphatidylinositol, especially. Inositol, if you have this thing right here, if this guy is called an inositol, then the whole thing is a phosphatidylinositol, because you actually call the rest of this part that is inside the green, that is called a phosphatidate group. Okay. So that's where the phosphatidyl comes from. And then whatever this is, whatever the third fatty acid is what you call the rest of it. Okay. Yeah, phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylinositol, phosphatidylserine. It's just what is the thing you have in the loading
that's attached to the phosphate.
Yes, and that determines a lot of its function. And so these guys are found depending on what they have right there in things like surfactant, in things like secondary messengers. So you have it in the cell membrane, you clip off the inositol, and then it becomes IP3, goes down and opens up the calcium gates. And so all of these are made in this same kind of pathway. And since it all kind of comes together, and it's going to review important topics that you will have again in capstone and in physiology, and I think you'll actually come up with these again in this biochem course, so it's kind of a preview as well for that. Okay. It just makes sense to me to throw it in here.
Was that phosphatidylcholine that was in surfactant?
Yes, well remembered. Surfactant and myelin sheaths. All right. So let's go ahead and wipe this out. Here we go. So, how the freak do we make these things? Well, first we need all the pieces. So, what are the pieces? We have a glycerol. So, we need to figure out how to make that. Plus fatty acids, free fatty acids, which we just talked about how to make those. And those together equal a tag. So, we've talked about this one. Great. How do we get the glycerol? And then we'll talk about how to put them together. Glycerol. Glycerol story. Glycerol story is going to go right here in this beautiful box of squareness. All right. Glycerol. And we're going to get that from two places. Dihydroxyacetone phosphate, or as I fondly call it. Where have we seen this before?
Glycolysis.
Glycolysis. Beautiful. It was that other part of it forked out and it made one useful thing and one stupid thing that we just changed into the useful thing. This was the stupid thing. It is no longer stupid. And it was dihydroxyacetone phosphate, but everybody just puts DAP. So, and DAP, turns out, if you take DAP and you reduce it with NADH, and since we're reducing, that means we're giving it a hydrogen. We use the NADH up, it floats away as NAD+, that is the letter N. And that ends up making this into glycerol 3-phosphate. You'll notice that DAP has a phosphate. And so this one down here isn't just glycerol, it's still going to have a phosphate because there was a phosphate there and we haven't done anything but add a hydrogen.
Is there an enzyme present?
The enzyme right there, I haven't found a name for it. So there probably is an enzyme present. It's possible it's spontaneous, but I haven't seen a name. So, or if I have completely forgotten it, but I seem to recall that I never found a name for that one. So I think it was spontaneous. All right, so DAP will become glycerol 3-phosphate. Glycerol 3-phosphate is going to go through a number of steps that we will talk about and will be changed into glycerol while you're also building the tags simultaneously. So you put stuff on, and then you rip off the phosphate, and then you put on the last thing. But before we do that, I'd like to talk about the other way we get glycerol. And that is, or how we get glycerol 3-phosphate. And that is from glycerol itself. Because when we chew up a tag, we have leftover glycerol. We're using the fatty acids for energy, and the glycerol is left over. Or when we use the phosphatidic family, the glycerophosphates. And so we have glycerol left over floating around. That glycerol can be used as a new backbone, so it's recycled.
Can that only be done in the liver with glycerol?
Yes, and that is what we're going to put right here is the enzyme that is only found in the liver, which is glycerol kinase. Liver only. This other pathway, fat and liver can do it. This one, just the liver. And this one is glycerol kinase. And it makes sense that it's a kinase because kinases do...
They phosphate.
They phosphate. Exactly. All right. And so this one is going to be both fat and liver. This one is just liver. All right. Now, once we have glycerol 3-phosphate, we want to, I'm going to go ahead and represent glycerol 3-phosphate in picture form now for the rest of this. That's glycerol 3-phosphate. First, second, and third carbons. So first, second, third. And we are going to take glycerol 3-phosphate Acl Transferase, which is an enzyme. And so I'm going to go ahead and G3p Acl Transferase. So G3p is naming this. Acl is naming the thing it's going to grab, which is acyl groups is another name for free fatty acids. So it's just going to take a free fatty acid and transfer it onto the G3p.
Do we need ATP for that kinase?
Yes. Good call. Rule of thumb for kinases that I have never found an exception to, and I have looked, they all use ATP. So, good catch. All right, and right here, the G3p Acl Transferase will go ahead and throw on a acyl group. And then it will act again. Some textbooks, I looked this up, and some textbooks say that it's the exact same enzyme. Some rename the enzyme so now that it's like monoacyl G3p Acl Transferase or whatever. And so it names it after what this molecule now is, but others just say it's the same enzyme over and over. And so I'm just going to leave this here. You can, what would this be called? It's going to be called glycerol 3-phosphate monoacyl Acl Transferase is what you would then call that enzyme.
You don't need any energy for that step?
Nope, transferases are nice and free.
Okay.
So, it goes like this. And we did that times 2. Next, once we have this, we want to cut off the phosphate, because in tags, as we talked about earlier, they don't have that phosphate there. And so before we stick anything there, we want to get it free and clear. So this is going to use the enzyme. Probably should draw my enzymes in a different color. Oh well. DAG, and actually, I think it's more commonly called phosphatidase. Phosphatidate, since it's a singular. Phosphatidate phosphorylase. Phosphatase. Because we're taking a phosphate off. That is correct. Phosphatidate is what you call this base molecule. Phosphatase means removing a phosphate and not putting it anywhere, leaving it as an inorganic phosphate floating through the cytosol. So this guy will fall off or be cut off, and then next we will have our third little thing here. We have this, and then the new thing I'll go ahead and stick in blue. We will use that first enzyme again to add our last one, and so we used G3p Acl Transferase, and went ahead and added on our last free fatty acid, and then this is a completed tag. What do we do with completed tags in the liver?
We send them out.
Yes, and we send them out using
VLDL.
VLDL, excellent, lipoproteins. And so this is going to go out into a VLDL, which I will draw a VLDL like so. This is VLDL, which will then go to a fat cell, fat or adipocyte, 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 however your accent prefers. Fat cell, and it will dump this inside. It'll, not the whole thing, that'll take up all the contents of the VLDL that it wants to, and the triglycerides actually are broken apart using the lipoprotein lipase, which we talked about in another one. So this docks using its ApoE, which says hello, and then ApoC2 activates the lipoprotein lipase enzyme, which grabs stuff out and cuts it up. And then actually the fat cell has to reassemble the triacylglycerol, but it has all the pieces.
That's the ACAT?
Yes. No, actually, that's for cholesterol.
Oh, that's right.
But the ACAT is in that cell. So ACAT is in all the cells. So, yep, and tags will then reside in the fat. All right. Clinical application. if you run out of, if you are making a ton of fat, because probably you're drinking a lot of alcohol, typically is what makes so that you have so much sugar that you make a ton of fat, and it also makes so your liver doesn't work super well because it's rough on the liver, and then the liver can't make apoproteins well enough. You probably have a deficiency in protein. If you get this disease, it's common to have a deficiency in apoproteins because you have a low protein diet and your liver is under a lot of stress, and so even if you have some protein, it struggles to make the apoproteins. No apoproteins, no lipoproteins. No lipoproteins, all the fat stays in the liver. That's why we get fatty liver. We run out of apoproteins.
Okay. So it has to have, because I'm trying to think, because if you have one that's defective, you just don't drop it off and you have it circulating. What's the difference so that it just stays there versus circulating in your blood, just you have really thick?
You mean for tags, or clarify, if you would? I didn't quite follow.
Maybe I'm thinking of hyperlipidemia.
You would have higher blood fatty acids and triacylglycerols and all that, because some of that does get in the blood, but we try to keep most of it contained, and the liver isn't going to release nearly as much. Just, well, we don't have apoproteins, just dump it in the blood. It's not going to do that.
Okay.
It'll put some out, and more than it normally would, but which is why we kind of see an elevation when we have that disease. But as I recall, the majority, a lot of it stays in the liver, and that gives us fatty liver, which is reversible. If it goes on long enough, the liver just is going to have major issues and lead to liver cirrhosis and failure, and that is irreversible because that means you've had death of hepatocytes, and the damage is irreversible in those locations. So you can have cirrhosis of just part of your liver, but usually, yeah, don't do it. Bad juju. So, all right. So that is how we get glycerol, and this is how we get glycerol. Then this was building, and so the way I would break it up is try to know where glycerol comes from as your first stepping stone. Your second stepping stone is those two enzymes acting to make the stuff.
So the rate limiting on this side would be the DHAP. So if you don't have a lot of sugar, so you're not producing, so like glycolysis, obviously, you have to have glycolysis going because you're going to want to store that excess sugar. And so is that going to be the rate limiting step?
Actually, the rate limiting step, well, this one is one of them. That is a regulated step. I wouldn't say it's the rate limiting. I think rate limiting goes back to the fatty acids.
Okay.
Making the fatty acids with the fatty acid synthase, I believe, is the rate limiting step. Again, regulation and rate limiting stuff I need to go and review, so take that with a hefty grain of salt.
Okay.
I do know, however, that most of the regulation for sure is, besides this one bit right here, most of it is in the previous pathway with the fatty acids. So, so let's go ahead and quickly do a review where, how do we get glycerol? How do we put it together? Okay? So, does it help when I do one out loud, or do you prefer to just do it from scratch?
No, it helps when you do it loud.
Okay, so the way that I would do this review is glycerol has two sources. One of them is which gets NADH to NAD to make glycerol 3-phosphate. The other one is recycled glycerol. Just use a kinase to add a phosphate. That uses an ATP. Done with part one. Part two. All right, so we have glycerol 3-phosphate, and we're going to have a glycerol 3-phosphate, that thing, Acl, that thing, transferase. Do that twice. After that, so that was basically all one step in my head, we have a phosphatidate, which is what we call this entire thing. Phosphatase, which is saying it's going to cut off a phosphate, cutting off that. Then we're just going to take the first enzyme again, stick it on, and then ship it out in VLDL. Now we're done. So stick 2 on, cut off the marble, stick another one on, send it out. But make sure you name the enzymes. And then that's the end of the story. Yeah. So go ahead and do your review, and then we'll have one fun thing, which I'll say the one fun thing briefly, and then you can do your review so that I can not let these guys have 5 minutes of anticipation. Right here, you can have a little side thing where instead of using this enzyme, you just kind of bend it around over here, and then you have a whole bunch of different things, enzymes, that can add a choline or add serine or whatever. And so you just don't use this enzyme, and then you get glycerophospholipids. So that is where they come from. You're right here, and then you just go a different direction instead of making a tag by cutting off the phosphate. So that is where that pathway lives. And then you can have all the glycero backbone guys. And you can moderately adjust this stuff up here so that it uses sphingosine instead of glycerol to get all the sphingophosphates, which are just, they're not glycerophosphates anymore because it's not glycerol, they're sphingosine phospholipids. The whole thing's phospholipids. So yeah, that's a little side note. Just if you need to know where it comes from, because it kills you otherwise. I can't remember stuff until I know where it fits. All right, and then that's it. Catch you later. Oh, check the notes. I'll put in stuff about regulation and the questions I couldn't answer eventually.